To help you with future sweaters, or with this one if it doesn't want to behave itself as far as gauge goes, I want to show you my favorite simple math trick for working on it. Let's say we start with this gauge in our pattern, same one we are in fact using, 4 stitches, 6 rows per inch. It's easy to tell that a 4-inch square would take 16 stitches and 24 rows. The way we get that is multiply the 4 stitches per inch times the 4-inch width we want. 4 times 4 is 16. The 4-inch length we want, still number 4, but times the 6 rows per inch. And it's easy to see that will result in a 4-inch square. Now the same is true over here if we have 5 stitches and 8 rows per inch. We do the same math. Still wanting a 4-inch square. 5 times 4 is 20, easy peasy. 8 times 4 is 32 rows. Now here is where it gets interesting and why it's helpful. We're only using, let me get that silly thread out of the way. We're only using 4-inch squares because they make it easy to see that this is true. If you need to change gauge because the pattern is written in this gauge, but you are getting some other gauge, for example this one, here is something that works very, very well for changing your stitch and row counts. First, divide the stitch gauge that you were supposed to get for the pattern by the one you actually get. So we're going to say it's this pattern, it's 4 stitches per inch, but in your yarn you get 5 stitches per inch. We want to know what is the relationship between those two numbers. It turns out if you divide 4 by 5, that tells you the relationship is that 0.8, 4 is 0.8 of 5. In other words, 4 is 80% of 5. So we need a percentage more stitches in order to get the same size of square, or anything, same size beach ball. So we take the number of stitches in the pattern, 16. We're pretending this is a whole pattern. Obviously it's not, but we're pretending. Take the actual number and divide them by the amount of the relationship that we discovered up here. Divide by 0.8 and you'll get 20. Well, we already wrote down, doing the math the other way, that it should be 20 stitches, so you can see that it does work. Let's do it again using the row relationship. It's pretty common that your stitch and row gauge will both be in different relationships from the stitch and row gauge of the original. If you didn't match, often you didn't match both directions and by different amounts, in other words. And here we discover that if you take my original row gauge, stitches per inch, well, rows per inch, and divide it by the row gauge I actually obtained, the relationship is 0.75, similar to 0.8, but not identical. So all the numbers that pertain to rows, we will also divide by 0.75 to get the number of rows that we actually need. And it does come out right. You can see it comes out 32. This is the way that I adjust most patterns. You will need to do small amounts of tweaking because what it doesn't tell you is things like curves, exactly what to do. But for simple patterns like this, think about this. Let's turn it into our sweater pattern. We added ribbing, still didn't change anything, and we stopped knitting at a certain point for the armhole and then divided the work in half. But we knew what this length was designed to be. Mine was 3 inches at 6 rows per inch. That would have been 18 rows. So let's do the math again. Let's see if it'll work out for us. remember that the relationship between the original row gauge and the row gauge I'm actually achieving is 0.75. So if the original pattern called for 18 rows, what if we divide 18 by 0.75? It tells us we need 24 rows. We can easily double check that in this case, see if the formula worked. What does it come out if we ask for 3 inches times 8 rows per inch? Ta-da! Same thing. So if you keep this firmly in your mind, and I do find it helps to write it out so that you don't put the wrong number in the wrong place, you can transfer most patterns, especially simple ones, from gauge to gauge.